contrary to popular perception, not only developed societies but also developing societies, they are more impactful, because in developing societies, these will cause double impact because of impact of non-communicable diseases as well as communicable diseases. And the WHO's goal, or the UN's goal, that by 2030 we would reduce by 1/3 premature mortality from non-communicable diseases through prevention and treatment and promotion of mental health and well-being is not likely to be met, because the UN did not pass a political resolution in September 2018. So the policies of the UN are going to remain the same. So how can we change the position? We can only change the position if Indian government and the Chinese government change their national policy and thereby create an impact on the UN when it meets again in 2025 to change the global policy. But the national policies can only change if we start talking to the policymakers. If we do not remain shy of the members of the parliament and the members of the legislative assembly and our own corporators and municipal commissioners, we can make changes from the ground up, so that by 2025 there is enough momentum built all over the world where the UN has to take notice. So the objectives of celebrating this World Kidney Day over the last 13 years have been creating an impact and awareness about our amazing kidneys, creating more and more screening programs of patients with diabetes and hypertension for kidney disease, encouraging preventive behaviors, educating medical professionals, and stressing the importance of national and local health authorities to control the CKD epidemic. Non-communicable diseases kill about 41 million people each year, and that is now equivalent to about 71% of all deaths globally. And chronic kidney disease is a major NCD and is an amplifier of other NCDs such as diabetes and cardiovascular disease. Unfortunately, the UN resolution fails to make CKD as a major threat. In 2010, 2.6 million people with kidney failure received dialysis or transplant worldwide. This number is projected to increase to 5.4 million by 2030. And a patient on dialysis or requiring dialysis or transplant is just the tip of the iceberg. 10% of all people have CKD. They don't come up to the dialysis stage, but they die on the way because of cardiovascular mortality. In 2016, CKD was the 16th cause of death all over the world. If the current policies continue of inertia, it will reach the 5th cause of death all over the world by 2040. This is fearsome, because once patient has proteinuria and he is not treated well, he is likely to more die because of a cardiovascular mishap rather than progress further to end-stage renal disease. More so because of the current social situations, poor sanitation, abuse of medication, acute renal failure continues to affect about 13 million people all over the world. And contrary to previous beliefs which were there 25-30 years back, that an acute kidney injury, if the patient survives, will recover, we are finding that more and more of these patients do not recover, and that they will slowly progress into chronic kidney disease. So the international kidney societies are aiming to have a 0 by 20 AKI by the year 2020. A very high goal, but without political support. Because there are inequalities. There are inequalities because of economic reality between the developed and the developing world. In the developing world also between the cities and the villages. In the villages also between who owns the assets and the one large majority who have no assets to their name. Social equalities, racial equalities. There are races in America also, like the Red Indians, Pima Indians, who have disproportionate incidence of diabetes and therefore a disproportionate incidence and prevalence of diabetic nephropathy and CKD. There are geographic inequalities. The north has better facilities for end-stage renal disease management, for CKD management, for NCD management as compared to the south. And there are discriminatory policies where governments by nature would focus more on the city dweller and ignore the rural population. So the World Kidney Day this year gives this important message and a realization and a need for awareness that kidney diseases do not fall from the sky. They are a product of the social conditions in which people live, are born, and work and die. So the social reality, which is a very important political statement coming from the promoters, is that we need to change the social situation for us to make any impact or survival in these people. Patients with lower economic levels are more likely to have the greatest burden of CKD. So what can we do? So this year, World Kidney Day, appeals to us to look at policy as the key driver of outcomes. And the policy can be your unit policy, can be your municipal policy, can be your state policy or the national policy. Whatever is our effort required to change and modify these policies should be done. From the national policy by appealing to the national policy holders, to the state, and ultimately to your own unit policy. How it should be done is also elaborated in the World Kidney Days toolkit. This is a template letter which everybody could send, whether a nephrologist or a non-nephrologist. This template letter simply magnifies and educates about the impact of non-communicable diseases in the community and the grave danger caused by ignorance about CKD in policy making. The second important thing at the global level from a larger perspective is the climate change. Climate change is occurring, it is true, no matter what Mr. Trump says, and exposure to higher temperature has a direct impact on health, such as increasing incidence of CV diseases, which increase your likelihood of developing CKD. So we can do our own small bit by reducing global warming, by reducing our waste that we generate, by reducing the use of biofuels, by reducing the use of electricity, transport, recycling the waste, and using and health education. In our units, health literacy is very important as far as long-term disease management is concerned, and unfortunately it is often ignored. At the national level, we appeal to the national government to increase the budgetary allocation for the management of NCD. It is simple economics and it is good business if the government start investing in its people. Because 17.9 million potentially productive life years are projected to be lost by 2030 in India because of NCD. 17.9 million potential productive life years will cost us $237 billion. This is higher than the combined expected loss of China, Russia, USA, Portugal and Brazil. And we have included China also in the projection. Because the Indian government is just shade better than the Burmese government. It spends so little out of its total government expenditure. The expenditure by the Indian government is only slightly better than the Burmese government. 3.6% of government expenditure in Burma is on healthcare. In India it is 5%. Bangladesh also fares better than us. 5.7% of its government expenditure. Leave aside Cambodia, a war-torn country, with 6.1%. So we need to appeal to our people, our government, that it has to increase the government spending on healthcare, because if it is not, then in India, of the total healthcare expenditure by an individual, 62% comes out of his pocket. This is out-of-pocket expenditure, causes catastrophic effect, pushing many people into a debt trap. Whatever little the government is allocating, unfortunately, is not being spent. There is less expenditure across all components. So that means the department sends money, the department simply doesn't use, the government sends money, the department simply doesn't spend the money and returns the money back to the government by March end. A stricter audit and control by the government on how the expenditure is controlled, more directions would go a long way. Himachal Pradesh and West Bengal in that particular year, I think 2016-17, were the worst performers for expenditure on NCD. There are some changes, I am not denying that. The National Health Mission has started, and of that, about 54,600 crores have been allocated. And recently the Pradhan Mantri dialysis program was started, 330 crores were allocated to it, and about 500 district level dialysis facilities were started. But CKD is not dialysis, CKD is not transplant, that is just the tip of the iceberg. The government has to spend more money and more efforts on preventive nephrology and create systems for it. There is a good network of primary health, a reasonable network of primary health available all over the country. Till now, they have been focusing on ANC care, on communicable diseases, tuberculosis control, polio control. Now is the time when they have recently started looking at non-communicable diseases. But this textbook for the medical officer, manual for medical officer, mentions some things about National Cancer Control Program for control of diabetes, heart disease and stroke, but ignores CKD. So there is a policy change which needs to be made as to what the medical officers at the primary health center should be doing as far as early detection and screening for CKD is concerned, with free availability of blood and urine tests at the PSC level. There are ANMs and ASHA workers in majority of the villages. Each ASHA worker has about 1,000 patients to look for. They are also being trained for NCD control, but the health informatics which they use is paper-based, and therefore there is severe gap in it. Jharkhand has started using mobile health, M-Health, for NCD control recently. So we need to keep on having advocacies at various levels as far as transparency is concerned, and we need more and more authentic data about the disease profile in this country. One such can be done, this objective can be reached by using renal registries. All over the world, all countries have renal registry. Even a small country like Singapore has a renal registry. Unfortunately, such a big country with 1,400 nephrologists, we do not have a single registry. Dr. Vivekanand Jha and Dr. Mohan Rajapurkar are making attempts at starting a registry for hemodialysis. But we need registries which will tackle even aspects which Dr. Valentine Lobo is going to talk about. Relatively uncommon diseases in the kidney, hemolytic uremic syndrome, atypical HUS, which a nephrologist might not be seeing every day, every month, at the most once or twice. But but if you have a renal registry which in which you report that case, suddenly you will have a huge number of cases from which the Indian experience will be generated. So we need advocacies. That is the theme of 2019. We need to put our voice together and speak to the people who matter, the stakeholders. We started doing that. We went and met Mr. Nitin Gadkari in the last week, and he gave us a patient hearing, and we gave him the appeal letter, and he sent that a note sheet to Mr. Nadda, the health minister. We plan to meet the Chief Minister, Dr. Milind Mane, the MLA, and he has already promised that he will give us a patient hearing, as well as the municipal authorities. Because healthcare is not only about healthcare policies. Healthcare also means we need to talk to the government organizations about how much salt is allowed in the food in this country. 77% of the salt comes out of processed food, and in Europe they have strict guidelines and action plans as to how they are going to control the salt in the food. Here, few big brands would have a label, nutrition label, where they would mention the salt content. But there are a number of unbranded wafers that you can get just across this hotel. So we need to control that. Another problem which is very close to our hearts and which we are trying to tackle is chronic kidney disease of unknown origin. There are beds, there are hotspots all over the world, from Central America, Egypt to Sri Lanka. These patients present to the nephrologist at a last stage, stage 4, stage 5, where they have very high azotemia, they are pale, but they are not diabetic, neither they are hypertensive. They are particularly poor people staying in small villages, belonging largely to one community known as the Banjaras, coming from and if you pick them early, they would present with hyponatremia and hypokalemia, especially during the summers. This is the profile of, this is also known as, this graph shows you the altitude of the village, of the place, and the patient who come. If you look, I have a huge patient base from Yavatmal, but Yavatmal is at a little height. As compared to Yavatmal, these surrounding areas are lower down. Ghatanji, Modi. Now my patients hardly ever come from Yavatmal city per se. It's in the high. But majority of them will come from these areas which are not the pink ones, right? Lower lying areas. So that means there is some relationship between where you are staying and where you are coming. What could that relationship be? Is yet to be explored. Because there are many factors which could be responsible for CKD-U. Sri Lanka has a similar epidemic. The Presidential Task Force looked at all these factors. We propose to also investigate them. And in SIMS we approached, we want to also do some basic research by using cell lines. And I acknowledge the help of Dr. Lokendra Singh, the director, and Dr. Rajpal, the director of the Basic Sciences Laboratory, who willingly accepted our proposal to look at cell lines and expose those cell lines to the well waters and see what happens. These people live in small villages, very small, 800 population villages, whose main source of water, drinking water, is such wells, which is not treated with anything. So we tried to talk to them and convince them that in Sri Lanka they started using RO, and the RO worked very efficiently in bringing down the prevalence of CKD in Sri Lanka. Why can't we do this in your village? The villagers told us that yes, it is possible to get a grant from the Zilla Parishad and put up a RO unit, but who is going to clear the electricity bill? We already have overheads of 65,000 yet to be paid for electricity. So these are practical problems. This made me aware that health care is not only health care, what the doctor and the nurse does with the patient. Healthcare is social development. Unless there is some kind of empowerment of those individuals for employment and education, this problem is difficult to be solved. This is an experiment from Jharkhand where non-communicable diseases are tackled with the help of the ASHA worker who goes home to home, monitors the blood pressure and things. In UK, they are trying to go beyond this model of the patient being a passive subject of interaction which leads to a change in his health status. They have come up with Think Kidneys, a transforming participation in chronic kidney disease program, where across this pyramid, from the easiest, that in the base of the pyramid, teaching the patient to ask 3 questions before he comes for a consultation. What is the disease that I have? What are the options that you offer me? And what is the likelihood that that option is going to be of benefit to me? From there up to the top of the pyramid, where the program is K-Home, where you become, rather than a pill dispenser, you actually become a coach to the patient for health care. Because health systems are, although centered around the patients, people, they have these various other circles like finance, information, governance, medicines and technology, human resources and service delivery to tackle, and which will ultimately affect what is going to happen to the people. We need to look at policies which involve each of these small circles around the people's healthcare delivery. To end, what should be the ideal policy? I will leave you with this quote from Mahatma Gandhi. He said, I will give you a talisman. Whenever you are in doubt or when the self becomes too much with you, apply the following test. Recall the face of the poorest, the weakest man whom you may have seen, and ask yourself if the step you contemplate is going to be of any use to him. Will he gain anything by it? Will it restore him to a control over his own life and destiny? I think it is time now that we as nephrologists go beyond our dialysis and transplant programs and start talking about policies which ultimately affect our people and their fates and destinies. Thank you.
Thank you also for the talk. Over to the chairperson for questions and comments.
Hello. As expected,
Hello.
As expected, excellent talk by Dr. Dhananjay Okarkar. He is known for innovative ideas and is a man of vision. He has already convinced Mr. Nitin Gadkari, and who has in turn promised to make changes in the national policy. I'll just summarize what Dhananjay has said, that we have a take-home message. First and foremost is that non-communicable diseases are responsible for 71% of deaths globally every year. Chronic kidney disease is a major NCD itself and an amplifier of other NCDs such as diabetes and cardiovascular disease. We have to raise awareness about amazing kidneys amongst people, and nephrologists cannot do that alone. We cannot change the scenario alone. So we ought to educate all medical professionals about their key role in detecting and reducing the risk of CKD. Both myself and Avinash, we have experience of 10 years from a belt which is known as Kharpan Patta of 100 kilometers in the 3 districts of Akola, Amravati and Buldana. Thousands have died and thousands are in CRF due to high levels of cadmium and lead in the drinking water. Government has spent 222 crores for new pipeline and supply of water, drinking water from the Van Dam. And government has put in RO plants in 84 villages. Still, people continue to drink underground water. So this is where the problem lies. And who will do the awareness amongst people at the grassroots level is the question. Advocacy at all levels, government and NGOs by INA seems to be the answer. And if Sri Lanka can formulate national policy on CKD and implement successfully, there is no reason why can't we do it. In current scenario, we can make a difference to millions of lives. After all, we have access to the central and state government. Avinash?
First of all, congratulations to Dhananjay. I am very sure about that we have given justice to this award by giving this award to Dr. Dhananjay Ukarkar, an eminent nephrologist, the ideas, very huge experience and always an entrepreneurship. I have got experience last 2 years working within an Yavatmal district, but the subject which we had touched, CKD of unknown origin. And the fact is there is no registry. Newer and newer patients are coming every day to my clinic. 10 patients I am exposed to, whose the diagnosis is not been certain. The cause of the etiological aspect is not been sure. CKD of unknown origin already had mentioned regarding Sri Lanka, Mexico, American epidemics, as well as the Udnan epidemics we all aware of it. Same is the scenario in the Yavatmal district. Very huge area, 17 talukas. But the tragedy is there is not a single dialysis unit in the Yavatmal district which has been run by the government machinery. There are very few dialysis units which have been run by the private. Even the trained nephrologist is not been working there in Yavatmal district. Huge population. This district has given 2 chief ministers to us, but the development as far as the renal aspect is concerned is very poor. And a specific part of the disease is the specific community, Banjara community, which he has already mentioned. They are staying at a low altitude among the Yavatmal districts, are exposed to the well water consumption, pesticides and all that, and even their lifestyle, economical condition is very poor. They are exposed to a lot of NSAIDs. We are working on this project since last 2 years. What is the cause of the CKD? Average survival of this community, those who are suffering with the CKD, is 40 years, something not more than that. Huge number of youngsters are dying without the facilities of the dialysis with the CKD, going for an instant renal disease. And the presentation is very typical. They are all hyponatremic, hypokalemic, emaciated, thin-built, malnourished, severely anemic, no hypertension. Hardly 5 to 10% of the patient has got hypertension. The rest of the people, either they are hypotensive or they are all been dehydrated. And multiple episodes of hyponatremia. Lot of indigenous medicine they are taking. Even NSAIDs and all are available at the grocery shops and all that. Either they consume alcohol or painkillers just to get relief from the pain after by evening hours. But there is no awareness which has been developed. A lot of NGOs are working. We are joining hand with them The Times of India has also mentioned a lot of, given a lot of weightage to this coverage to these issues, but I feel that there is no development as far as the political development are concerned. During my travel to whole this country, whole this district last year, I tried my level best to contact all these politicians, but I feel this is not going to make their vote back. Till that time, I don't think they will get some awareness. Even the medical college, Yavatmal has got no dialysis unit established. We had some funds sanctioned by the government of Maharashtra, but the dialysis unit is not been established. No nephrologists. We people from Central India are going, Nephrology Society are going once a month there and rendering our services. But I just want to ask to the audience, what is their experience? That we have got delegates, the eminent people from the Pune and the Mumbai as well. What is their experience as per the CKD of unknown origin, what they are exposed to? Because this huge number of patients are coming up, and I am very sure about within a year or two, this will be labeled as CKD unknown origin, Yavatmal, as an epidemic. So I will be happy to share this experience with the rest of the people. Anybody who wants to share this as per the CKD of unknown origin is concerned. And I will welcome the audience if any questions they want to ask.
If no questions, I would request Dr. Charulata Pawan to read out the Excellence Award to be presented to Dr. Okata, sir. Thank you.
The citation reads as the Nephrology Society Nagpur Professional Excellence Award. The Nephrology Society Nagpur is pleased to confer Dr. Mrs. H.R. Salkar Memorial Professional Excellence Award on Dr. Dhananjay Okharkar, MD, DNB Nephrology, in recognition of his lifelong dedication to excellence in nephrology. He started and nurtured dialysis technician training program. He is the leading light of the Nephrology Society Nagpur and has been disseminating the knowledge of nephrology through academic and community activities. Your dedication, enthusiasm and insight are really inspiring, sir. This is on 17th March 2019. Chairman Dr. Samir Chaubey and Secretary Dr. Manish Palla. Thank you.
I request Dr. Pawan and Chairperson to please present. Thank you.
We now move on to the next session. Our guest speaker, Dr. Valentine Lobo sir, will be delivering a talk on spectrum of HUS. To chair this session, I invite Dr. Ashwini Kumar Khandekar and Dr. Shilpa Hazarmani. Dr. Khandekar is consultant nephrologist and transplant physician at Care Hospital, Nagpur. Dr. Shilpa Hazarmani madam is consultant pediatrician at Gateway Hospital, Nagpur. Now I request Dr. Amit Pasari to kindly introduce Dr. Valentine Lobo sir to the gathering.
MD Medicine from AM Hospital, Mumbai, and he did his DSB in nephrology from prestigious MPUH Nadia in 2001. He has almost 17 publications to his credit and 7 chapters, textbook chapters to his credit. He has special interest in acute kidney injury, hemodialysis and its variants, and especially thrombotic microangiopathy. In fact, he is our savior when it comes to the evaluation of patients with atypical HUS and T3 glomerulopathy for the various complement studies. He is currently the consultant nephrologist at AM Hospital, Pune. I hand over the mic to the chairperson. Good afternoon.
HUS has a very wide spectrum of age, spectrum of presentation, spectrum of consequences, and it is only fitting that we have both pediatric experts and adult experts here listening to this particular presentation. HUS can present in variety of setups and variety of forms and has so many overlapping differential diagnosis. This is exactly what we want to demystify, hopefully with the help of Dr. Valentine Lobo's talk. Over to Dr. Lobo.
Thank you, Dr. Khandekar, and thank you, Dr. Balwani, and the organizing committee for inviting me to speak on a topic which has fascinated me for the last 22 years. As you just said, this is a condition which spans both pediatric and adult medicine. How do I go forward? It's not showing here. Yeah. So, in the scope today, I will cover the classification of HUS. I'll talk about antibody-mediated atypical HUS, which is the commonest form in Indian children, snake bite and HUS, what genetic testing we do at present, DJK, diaxyl glycerol kinase epsilon associated, and the use of functional assays. Next. Okay. So, when I first became aware of this disease in 1997, the hematologists were calling it TTP, the nephrologists were calling it hemolytic uremic syndrome, and the textbooks thought it was some sort of combination of the two. But that has all changed. Please go back. That has all changed today, and what we start with is a diagnosis of thrombotic microangiopathy, which is a manifestation of low platelet count thrombocytopenia, a microangiopathic hemolytic anemia that is Coombs negative, and organ injury in the form most often of acute kidney injury. If this is associated with low values of ADMTS30, a disintegrin and metalloproteinase with thrombospondin 1 7-like domains deficiency, we call this disease TTP. The disease is also, the manifestation of thrombotic microangiopathy is also associated with a number of other conditions, solid organ and stem cell transplantation, pre-existing nephropathies, various other conditions, malignant hypertension, scleroderma, renal crisis, organ transplantations, and drugs, and all of these would have thrombotic microangiopathies. But if it is associated particularly with dysregulation of the alternative complement pathways, then this is called atypical hemolytic uremic syndrome. Next slide. This classification is taken from the Lancet in 2017, and it classifies which conditions we now call hemolytic uremic syndrome. The hemolytic uremic syndrome may be associated with certain infections more commonly than others, among them Shiga toxin producing an E. coli, strep pneumoniae, and in the case of strep pneumoniae, what I said about Coombs negative hemolytic anemia is not quite true, because this condition can have a Coombs positive hemolytic anemia, and in recent years H1N1. There's also a group of diseases which are associated mainly in infancy with cobalamin C deficiency, and finally the group which is called atypical HUS or atypical hemolytic uremic syndrome. These may be associated if they present in the first year of life with a deficiency of an intracellular enzyme called diacyl glycerol kinase epsilon, or most commonly with dysregulation, as I said, of the alternative pathway of complement, either because of a genetic mutation in the regulators or an autoantibody that blocks the activity of the regulator. Finally, about 50% of these atypical hemolytic uremic syndrome, with all the tools at our disposal today, we do not find a cause. Next slide, please. Yeah. So, a brief word about what happens in this condition. The complement is a part of our immune process, and it is normally activated by three pathways: the classical pathway, the lectin pathway, and the alternative pathway in response to infection or inflammation. All of these pathways ultimately result in the generation, in the activation of the complement factor 3, C3, which is activated to C3a by a C3 convertase. In the alternative pathway, this is normally maintained in a continuous low level of activity, but it gets amplified by the present C3 combines with factor B to produce a C3 convertase, and thus loop becomes self-amplifying. In addition, the C3 convertase, the activated C3 activates complement factor 5 acting as a C5 convertase, and that results in finally the formation of C6 to C9, which is a membrane attack complex, which then produces endothelial damage, thrombosis and microangiopathic hemolysis along with organ dysfunction, the end product of this thrombotic microangiopathy. Next slide please. Yeah. So in India, this study is taken from the Pediatric Nephrology Department of the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, and it's the biggest study in the world till today. The commonest, 56 to 57% of children in India with the atypical hemolytic uremic syndrome have antibodies to complement factor H, which is a regulator of the alternative pathway. Complement factor H regulates complement activity both in the fluid phase of the blood as well as on cell surfaces. And in this study, most of these patients had blocking antibodies which bound to the C-terminal portion of factor H and prevented it from binding to the endothelial cell surfaces. Importantly, measuring factor H activity does not correlate with the antibody titers, and this is a more severe disease than is found in other forms of HUS, was what the AIM study found. Next slide please. So this is my own data on 55 patients, 55 children whom I have seen over the years in our department. If I was showing this slide 8 years ago, I would be showing that entire group in orange as idiopathic. But after the AIM study got published, what we did was to go back to our banked samples of serum and analyze them for autoantibodies with the assay that we set up in our lab. And today, what we find is almost entirely similar to what the AIM study showed, that almost 50% of the children who present with atypical hemolytic syndrome have antibodies to factor H. Next slide, please. It's different in adults because over here, postpartum or pregnancy-related hemolytic syndrome occupies about 40% of the adult patients whom we see, and it is followed by wiper bite-associated AHAs in adult patients. So in children, autoantibodies. In adults, this is our data as updated as of January this year, 78 patients. In adults, postpartum and snake bite are the commonest. Next slide, please. Yeah. So this is a comparison of several studies, and I inserted the AIM study and our own data into this table taken from David Kavana's paper in Seminars in Nephrology. What is notable is that as compared to all the Western studies which show that about 5 to 13% of all autoantibody of all AHAs is autoantibody mediated, the AIM study found it in 56%, and our own data tells us it's about 50% too. All the studies across the world show that autoantibody disease is seen in 75 to 100% of children in these series. It's seen in slightly older children around 8 to 8.5 years of age, and if you look at the last row, that's what is worrying. 30 to 40% of these patients will at 1 year reach the composite endpoint of either renal failure or end-stage renal disease or death. Next slide, please. Yeah. So this is what the AIM study found. Untreated patients, well, 60% at 5 years would be dead or with end-stage renal disease, but plasma exchange dramatically improved the outcome of these studies, and adding a maintenance immunosuppression, the AIMS regimen was steroids, mycophenolate and rituximab, improved the outcomes and decreased the relapses even further, so that almost 85% of these patients would be alive with intact renal function at 5 years if they receive both plasma exchange and maintenance immunosuppression. Next slide, please. And this prompted an editorial which was written by Achanta in the Kidney International in 2014, saying that the C3 levels rather than factor H levels correlated. Low C3 correlated better with anti-factor H antibody titers. Starting anti-factor H titer of more than 2,000 arbitrary units was associated with a higher risk of relapse. The predictors of adverse outcomes were a titer of more than 8,000, low C3, during the acute phase, and finally that maintenance therapy would decrease the relapses at 1 year from 31% to about 8%. In comparison to this is a paper which appeared from the University of Newcastle in 2017 in the Kidney International. Now, when they looked at 175 children in their series, only 9.7% were associated with autoantibodies. So this is the difference between the European data and the Indian data. And in addition to that, while the clinical spectrum was roughly the same, what they found was that 7 of their patients had, in addition to anti-factor H antibodies, 7 of them also had mutations in various genes in the complement pathway. So the UK tends to call this antibody plus, meaning that there are autoantibodies, but it's also associated with mutations in the disease. And because, and what is known today, the AIMS data also showed it in 90% of the patients. Most of these patients, in addition, the trigger for forming antibodies is a homozygous deletion in complement factor H related proteins 1 and 3, mainly in related protein 1, which results in a loss of self-recognition, because the terminal portion of factor H R1 is very structurally homologous to factor H, and so cross-reacting antibodies block the binding site of factor H. Now, what the UK study did was 11 out of their 17 patients received plasma exchange, while 4 or 5 of their patients received eculizumab. And today, the standard of care across Europe is eculizumab. Eculizumab is not officially available to us in India, and even when available, it is prohibitively expensive. We don't know to what duration it should be given. One injection costs about 75,000 rupees, and it has to be given weekly for a minimum period of 2 years and lifelong after a transplant. Now, what the UK study found was that although antibody titers decreased in patients given plasma exchange, despite this, 4 out of 7 of their patients still developed end-stage renal disease, and 5 of them had subsequent relapses. Like the AIMS study, the relapses were aborted with maintenance immunosuppression. When they gave eculizumab, even though the antibody titers were maintained at a high level or actually rose, none of their patients experienced, only 1 of their patients experienced a relapse, and there was preserved renal function in 80% of their patients at 5 years of follow-up. So, something about the anti-factor H antibody assay. We use an ELISA, which is based on a cutoff for positive and negative controls. Our assay requires 60 microliters of serum. For comparison of the results and standardization of the readout, we run a common positive sample supplemented with a common negative sample each time to ensure the validity. There is a specific background sample in which we do not add the reagent factor H, but we prepare a background sample using the test plasma. Certain assays have been shown, like the French one, to perform better in high background samples. That is, samples which have hemolysis, samples which are lipidemic, or which contain a rheumatoid factor. The reason why this is called arbitrary units is that the normal has to be determined for each population. And we did that by testing children who were coming in for a school health checkup and healthy blood bank donors. We found a median value of 66 in our population in Pune, with a range from 0 to 100. Importantly, the samples need to be diluted because the linearity of ELISA optical density readings only exists between 1 and 2.5, and only free antibodies are detected. So if you have given a patient fresh frozen plasma or plasma exchange, then the fresh frozen plasma contains normal factor H, which binds avidly to the antibodies in the sample, and such samples give us false negative readings. If you tell us that you have used fresh frozen plasma, then what we do is to try to separate the antibody antigen complexes by using a high ionic strength solution before assaying. And we validated our method by using the Newcastle standard, which we obtained from them, and also by sending a batch of our samples to be assessed separately in Newcastle. This is what we found when we looked at it. What we had was a fairly high titer in acute illness, highest titers in patients who had relapsed. The titers dropped in remission, and also in convalescence. And we also assessed C3 glomerulonephritis, and we found much lower titers as compared to atypical HUS. Now, is there a qualitative in addition to a quantitative difference in the anti-factor H antibodies? This is a paper from Immunology by Caroline Blanc, where she compared the antibodies in C3GN with atypical HUS, and what she found was that while the mean titers were not significantly different, antibodies from C3GN possessed weaker interaction with factor H. They tended not to form immune complexes. They bound to the N-terminal end, which is the active enzymatic portion of factor H rather than the surface binding region, and they perturb the fluid phase regulation rather than the surface antigen. And this is what Caroline Blanc's paper showed. These are the antibodies in atypical HUS, and these are the antibodies in C3GN. And when you look at the binding of factor H, it is much stronger for the antibodies in HUS as compared to C3GN. Sorry. So in 2014, across Europe, Rachel Watson published this paper where the three labs, Newcastle, Paris and Jena in Germany, standardized the assay across. What they did was to reanalyze 36 of the samples, 12 from each of these centers, using the others assay to find out which was the most robust. And what they found was it was the Paris standard which was the most robust and also the most reproducible. Commercial ELISAs did well in the middle range of the spectrum, but they tended to give more false negatives at the lower end, and they tended to cluster together at the higher end. And when we evaluated our ELISA against the Newcastle standard, that's exactly what we found too. So what we did was to obtain the Newcastle standard and revalidate the commercial assay against the Newcastle standard. And now, as the standard is getting over across Europe, what we do is to keep our own positive controls as reference samples in order to revalidate the commercial ELISA each time we buy a new kit. I move on to snakebite and hemolytic uremic syndrome and go to this report from Gopal Krishnan, which was published in 2017 in Indian Journal of Nephrology. But really, snakebite and HUS dates all the way back to 1986, when Date and Shastri published from CMC Vellore the first report of the 16 cases following Russell's viper bite. There are 2 case reports from Australia with the brown snake and tiger snake, but most common reports from South India and from Sri Lanka show that it's commonest with the hump-nosed viper bite. And this hump-nosed viper venom is not covered by the ASV in our standard Hafkin polyvalent anti-serum, or even the one made by Bharat Serums and Serum Institute. So hump-nosed viper bite is commonly associated with HUS, and as you can see, there is only, according to these reports, only a modest benefit to be seen with plasma exchange. It could be because the early damage is caused by the venom and earlier, and that is before we initiate plasma exchange. Now, this is our own data of 18 patients with whom we have treated, and what we found is that thrombocytopenia was seen in 17, high LDH in 16, all 18 were dialysis dependent. We found extrarenal manifestations in 4 of them, neurological were in 2. Low C3, as we started to test, we found in 5 of 7 patients, and we actually had very good results with either plasma infusion and dialysis or plasma exchange. 2 of our biopsies, one showed cortical necrosis and this patient developed CKD. Overall, we had 4 deaths in the acute phase, complete recovery in 11 patients, and 3 progressed to chronic kidney disease at follow-up. Why does snake venom produce hemolytic uremic syndrome? A factor known as the cobra venom factor, which is a C3 convertase, has been isolated from cobra venom. It will be interesting to see whether the hump-nosed viper venom contains a similar factor. This initiates the complement pathway by forming a very stable C3 and C5 convertase, and this type of a factor has also been isolated from the Botrop species and from the Microcururus species of snake venom in Brazil. In fact, Gabriel Tanaka looked at what various species of Microcururus snake venom did and the amount of activated complement that they produced, and this is what he showed, that there was a universally, as compared to saline control, phosphate buffer saline control, the snake venom, the Microcururus venom, produced much larger amount of activated C3, C4 and C5. And when he looked at what they would do to in vitro sheep RBC lysis, this is what you can see. A very high degree of lysis, and sheep RBC lysis is normally protected by human plasma which contains factor VIII. But when the microfluorous venom was added, in this situation, large amounts of RBC lysis were found. When do we do genetic studies in atypical HUS? This is the consensus statement from the International Society of International Pediatric Nephrology Association of 2016, Chantal Lawrence group. What they say is, if there is no preceding sugar toxin E. coli infection, if there is no severe ADMPS13 deficiency, or no hyperhomocystinemia, then at the very first episode, genetic testing is recommended. In relapses, it's always recommended. Where there is a family history, it's recommended. In postpartum cases, post-transplant cases, and prior to renal transplantation, where the cause is unknown. What is available to us today in the form of genetic testing are two tests that we use: multiple ligated probe amplification assays and next generation sequencing. This is what the multiple probe ligation assay is. It's a variant of the polymerase chain reaction, but what is done is, after the DNA strands are separated, then probes to specific exons, in this case complement factor H, complement factor I, and complement factors H related proteins 1 to 5, these probes to exons are added to the mix. Only those exons to which the probes bind are then ligated, and what is done, and then separated by capillary electrophoresis. A control sample is run with each, and the result is reported as a copy number variation. If the control sample contains 2, 1 from each chromosome of each of the exons, then the ratio of the electrophoretic signal gives the number of copies of the amplified probes in the test sample. Next generation sequencing is usually done on a ready-made, the Illumina TrueSight 1 panel, which sequences 4,800 different genes. It is the first line of testing for a patient with a particular set of symptoms where we know what genes specifically we are looking at. It does not help in diagnosing a disease where we do not know the gene, or where we are looking for a new gene in this situation. In fact, the Illumina TrueSight 1 does not contain diacylglycerol kinase epsilon deficient exons, and in fact our genetists had to develop an in-house panel to detect DAGKE, as I will show you. What we found, or what I've learned, is that in addition to molecular biology, next generation sequencing is a high amount of bioinformatics. The data which comes out of it has to be filtered, and it needs specific softwares to do this, and comparison with a very accurate database. And finally, that's how the result finally comes. Since the human genome, 30 million base pairs, there is a huge amount of redundancy. This is an MLPA of a 34-year-old patient whom we had recently. She presented with what looked like an rapidly progressive renal failure, but had a thrombotic microangiopathy on biopsy. Now what you can see over here, this is not, okay, yeah. So the exon 23 of complement factor H is giving a signal in the capillary electrophoretogram that is 1.5 times that of the control, indicating that there are 3 copies of exon 23. And when you go to exon 6 of CFHR1, if the signal intensity is half the control, indicating there is 1 copy. So 3 copies of exon 23 and 1 copy of exon 6. This is a heterozygous gene shift. Exon 23 has also been expressed on 1 chromosome in place of exon 6 of complement factor HR1. So this is a hybrid gene. The protein will be a hybrid protein which contains the terminal binding site of factor H on factor HR1 protein. Right. So complex genomic rearrangements of gene hybrids were first reported in 2018, and it turned out that we picked 2 cases last year, soon after this paper appeared in JASN in February last year. It is a non-allelic homologous recombination which is responsible for 3 to 5% of HUS cases, and importantly, it is completely missed, as the Spanish paper showed. All 9 cases that were picked up by MLPA could not be detected on next generation sequencing, and only 3 out of the 9 could be detected even on Sanger sequencing. And this is what they found. So you could have a situation in which you have the N-terminal factor H, that is short consensus repeats 1 to 18 are of factor H, and then the terminal, the binding site, the C-terminal binding site contains instead the protein of CFHR1, which is a very weak binding surface site. This could also happen with short consensus reverse from CMC below. The opposite is what we found in our patient, in which the factor HR1 protein actually contained the terminal exon of factor H. So it formed a factor HR1 protein which would actually compete with factor H. And factor H, R1, R5, these are the related proteins because of their homology, but they have no biological activity. So for this reason, you have a protein which competes with the normal factor H for binding, but is unable to perform its function. Between factor H and factor H related protein 1, it is the binding site which is slightly different. There is a 1 nucleotide substitution in this, and it is a weak competitor therefore in the normal circumstances. When a hybrid gene forms, this becomes identical. The factor H R1 terminal portion becomes identical to that of complement factor H, and it becomes a strong competitor but without any biological activity. And these are the previous reports which came from, almost all of them have been from Spain, Portugal and Italy. In a retrospective analysis of 522 cases by Elena De George, she found these hybrid genes in 9 patients. They were all unrelated. The disease penetrance was 50%, which depends on how much of normal factor H is produced from the other chromosome which does not contain the mutation. So this is a heterozygous condition. And 7 out of the 9 patients were women, and 4 out of those 7 had their first episode in the postpartum period. This is another interesting patient whom we had. This patient came to me in 2016 after having received a transplant from his wife, and at the time when he came to me, his creatinine 3 years later was 5.5, so he was about to lose his graft, and he had undergone a renal biopsy, and it had been reported as MPGN. When I re-looked at the biopsy, what I found was a severe thrombotic microangiopathy. And he came to me because his aunt, his maternal aunt, had also been transplanted by me 5 years earlier. Now when we went through the family history, we found that over 3 generations, there were 16 patients in this family who had developed chronic kidney disease, and all of them had come as near end stage, and so a renal biopsy of the native kidneys had never been done in any of these patients. We went ahead and did an MLPA on these patients, on 5 of the patients, 5 of them who were alive and who could give samples, and also on 2 unaffected members of the family, and this is what we found. What you can see is the entire CFH R1 and R3 genes are giving no signal in the capillary electrophotogram. So there is a homologous deletion completely of CFH R1 and R3. All the exons are missing over here. And this was seen even in the unaffected members of the family. And this index patient's son also had a heterozygous condition, a heterozygous deletion in him, but he was asymptomatic at the age of 16 years. Now, when we looked at an NGS on both these patients, my patient and the patient who was losing his graft, he's now back on dialysis, by NGS, we could find no mutation. So, as I said, in this situation, it's the MLPA and not a next generation sequencing which picks up the disease. This is all our data that we have till today. Familial, we tested 5 out of 16 by MLPA, and we picked up deletions in all 5. When we tested 2 of them by NGS, we got nothing. When we looked at, this is my student's thesis, 9 patients with postpartum HUS, we looked at MLPAs, we found heterozygous deletions in 7 and homozygous in 2. When we looked at an adult patient here, we got nothing. We looked at 2 adolescents with end-stage renal disease who came to us. We picked up on NGS, we picked up multiple disease-causing mutations in factor H. These are the only factor H mutations that we have found till today, though the West reports them as being the commonest mutations in these patients. We picked up 2 on NGS. When we looked at post-transplant recurrence, once again the MLPA came to our help very easily. In all 6 patients except for 1, we could pick up deletions. And when we looked at 2, this is the gene hybrid which I just mentioned earlier. When we looked at children, what we found was that most commonly the MLPA would pick up homozygous deletions in all the antibody cases, and the Ames report was exactly the same. When we looked at 2 siblings who had relapsing AKI, one of them we lost. He died in the acute phase at the age of around 18 months, and his sister developed end-stage renal disease at the age of 12 after a relapsing course. And what we found was a homozygous missense mutation in ADMTS13, very surprisingly. And 2 of my colleagues' patients who presented in the first year of life with a severe HUS, we found deletions, homozygous deletions in exon 2 and exon 4 of diacylglycerol kinase epsilon. So this is what is the data from the 2 DAGK patients. The age at presentation was within the first year. There was consanguinity in 1 family, 3rd degree. The hemoglobin was very low at presentation, platelets were low. LDHs were very high. Interestingly, both these patients also had low C3, which is extremely rare. Of the around 50 cases of DAGK related disease reported in the world, 5 have been reported as having low C3, and both our patients also had low C3, and one of them also had high anti-factor H antibody titer at first presentation. But despite treating this with plasma, this patient progressed very rapidly. And these are the deletions which we picked up in exon 2 and exon 4. My student, as I said, reviewed for her thesis the 3 recent studies which have been published. This is a study from Spain published last year. This was year before last. This was a multi-center study, Italy, France and Newcastle, of postpartum HUS, and we added the 10 women who had 12 pregnancies with 11 episodes of HUS in her thesis, and this is what we found. 90% of our patients, like the Spanish patients, had HUS in their first pregnancy. 1 had a relapse, 1 out of 2 had a relapse. LSCS seemed to be a major risk factor. We used only plasma exchange, whereas these 2 studies have now used a lot of eculizumab. In spite of that, our results are much better. This is the French study published in 2010, where the 30-day end-stage renal disease or death was 62% when plasma exchange was used, whereas our survivals are 100%, though 3 of our patients who had cortical necrosis have developed chronic kidney disease. As compared to that, these 2 studies have used less of plasma exchange and more of eculizumab, and their results are excellent. So what did we find? All our patients had CFHR mutations. Only the Spanish study had this in 33% of their patients. Otherwise, across Europe, it's CFH mutations, which are common in postpartum HUS. We found anti-factor H antibodies in 4 out of our 10 patients. This has not been reported or is absent in the European patients. This is how a heterozygous deletion looks. The signal intensity in the capillary electrophotogram is not absent, as I showed in the homozygous. It is half the intensity of the control. So this is how homozygous deletions, failure of self-recognition, and therefore the lack of immune tolerance with antibody formation. A Chinese study has reported that single nucleotide polymorphisms may be responsible for a change in the structure of factor HR1 from a beta-pleated to a random coil, and this mutated protein inhibits the normal cofactor activity of factor H. So what is the significance of CFHR1R3 deletions? Well, this is a study from various populations. In Europe, it's found in about 3% of the general population. It's found in 15% of Pakistanis and 33% of Nigerians. What I asked our lab to do was to run the samples through the algorithm of those patients for whom genetic testing had been requested for conditions other than HUS. And what we found was that 10% of these patients also had this mutation. And in the Ames data, they say they found it in 9% of control population. So it's very similar to what Ames has also been finding. The presence of, we heard about evidence-based medicine. the presence of a mutation on NGS or MLPA is not equal to evidence of the disease. So we could have an association where the variant segregates with the disease. In silico analysis is sometimes used to predict what the mutation might cause. And fortunately in HUS, we have a functional in vitro assay which we do. This is what we do. We incubate plasma samples with an APC-FTD buffer, 80 microliters and 100 microliters of sheep RBCs. This is based on the premise that normally sheep RBCs are protected from hemolysis by factor H in normal human plasma. If there is less factor H activity, the RBCs will be lysed. We then stop the reaction by adding 1 ml of ice cold veronal buffer, centrifuge the sample and read it at 415 nanometers in a spectrophotometer. This is what we got. Now when we looked at our antibody related disease, we would have expected that this patient who has an antibody titer of 7000 would have the highest degree of in vitro activity, but it was not. A patient who had an anti-factor H antibody titer of 800 produced the highest hemolysis in vitro, indicating that the antibodies titers, more than the titers, there may also be a qualitative difference in the types of antibodies which the ELISA does not detect. This is what I looked at several patients. Normal plasma would inhibit the reaction in vitro, so that's a good test to see that the assay is inhibited by normal plasma which contains enough of factor H. And when we saw what was happening, relapsing cases had again the worst amount of in vitro hemolysis, and it went down with treatment and in the convalescent stage. And when this is from Caroline Blum's paper, where what she did was she compared the antibodies using the in vitro lysis assay of atypical HUS versus C3GN, and there was a much larger amount of hemolysis in the in vitro assay with HUS antibodies as compared to C3GN antibodies. Yeah. This is what the Spanish group did. The Spanish group were the ones who developed this assay first. When they found a new variant where you could not predict the functionality, they assessed it by the in vitro assay, and they also assessed it by adding the serum samples of the new mutation to a control in which they knew was pathogenic for HUS. And interestingly, these two variants which they were testing inhibited the hemolytic activity of known HUS positive serum samples, indicating that these are variants of unknown significance and not pathogenic mutations. I was able to look at 2 snakebite patients in the convalescent phase, and even in convalescence, what I found was that the in vitro assay showed that these patients' plasma demonstrated a more than normal hemolytic activity in vitro. So snake venom is the trigger factor for patients who are predisposed, it appears, to complement activation. So if I had to summarize, the spectrum of HUS, as I said, is still evolving. In Indian children, antibody-mediated disease predominates. It's more than 50 to 60%. Viper venom comes second, and it may also be activating complement pathways in susceptible individuals. CFH R1 and R3 deletions segregate with autoantibody disease. We don't know as yet what is the role in adults. We are finding them in various disease conditions, but we just don't have the numbers as yet. Hybrid gene disease is rare. It requires an MLPA and not an NGS for detection, and our functional assay can clarify the role of newly detected mutants. I have to acknowledge the help of a huge team. It's our microbiologists who help me with all the immunological tests that we do. Nikhil is our molecular genetist who has made it possible for us to do all these tests. And of course, I have a wonderful set of colleagues in the department who are always supportive. And of course, these 2 patients. From them, I have learned a lot about the disease, and I've also realized that there is a lot more to learn. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for the informative.
Which we have only read in textbooks. We now understand after your disposition that anti-factor H antibody needs to be checked, at least in children, if not in adults. And just to summarize, we have understood that anti-factor H antibody plays an important role in children as an etiology of
especially in India.
especially in India, more so than the Western population and the Western information that we have. Probably not so much in adults. Snake bite, we have to be on the lookout whether they are developing HUS. The drop in platelets should be associated and should be looked for, and HUS should be thought of as a reason, and it may not be a simple acute tubular necrosis. Genetic studies, Dr. Lobo highlighted that if there is not a typical situation, if it is not Shiga toxin associated, if it is not a typical post-diarrheal situation, and so genetic studies should be thought of early, especially if family history is there. We may associate it with other family members. What I would like to ask before I leave it to our audience for questions is there a situation where a surgical stress can play a role in precipitation of, and are these cases the genetic ones that we are missing out? So is surgical stress a role?
Yeah. I showed you the data both from the Spanish study and from our own data that all the postpartum HUS which we found were associated with LSCs, not with normal deliveries. Now, does this mean that the stress of surgery is responsible, or were these just higher risk cases is something that we didn't look at? We just have the data at present. But the Spanish study seemed to also suggest that LSCs in some way, so some form of a surgical stress would sort of precipitate the disease in susceptible individuals. So there are various triggers. This is a disease which requires two hits. The first is the genetic predisposition and the second is the trigger. The trigger could be drugs, the trigger could be snake venom, the trigger could be pregnancy, and specifically the postpartum, because normal placenta contains what is called as decay acceleration factor, which also regulates complement. It's when the placenta separates that the mother is no longer protected by the decay acceleration factor. And that's why this disease follows a normal pregnancy in the postpartum.
And then it will have a high likelihood of recurrence after transplant.
Yeah.
So if transplant is not on the scene, would you still recommend doing genetic studies in these patients?
If the genetic studies are expensive, I would recommend genetic studies in a situation where, one, I have had a partial response. I didn't go into treatment and I didn't go into transplant for lack of time. But I would recommend genetic studies in a situation where I have a partial response to plasma exchange and I want to know what do I do next. Do I continue plasma exchange, and if so, for how long? Do I consider adding immunosuppression? Do I ask the patient about eculizumab if he can afford it? These are the situations where a genetic testing would help. If you look at the Western algorithms, they say draw a sample at diagnosis for genetic testing. Do anti-factor H antibody and ADMTS13 as soon as the patient comes, and then start plasma exchange. That's the algorithm. So I didn't go into that because it's a treatment algorithm. But that may not be practical. Genetic tests are expensive. So if I have a patient who has developed end-stage renal disease and is staying on dialysis, I won't. If the patient is ever going to contemplate transplant, then I definitely would do it. And most of the time what we've done is we've paid for the genetic studies out of our research funds. We haven't asked the patients to do it.
Excellent, Dr. Lobo. As a pediatrician, actually, I would be more interested in post-infectious HUS actually. Many times use of antibiotics are contraindicated in HUS, but in pediatric age group, especially pneumococcal associated HUS, we have to use antibiotics.
In pneumococcal, you have to use antibiotics and you're not supposed to use plasma. I didn't, again, as I said, I didn't go into treatment. Plasma is contraindicated in pneumococcal HUS. So that's one point to it.
Yeah, and the literature says that meropenem and azithromycin are the better clearing drugs. So apart from aminoglycoside, is there anything like these antibiotics are contraindicated?
No.
In
pneumococcal, no. Nothing is called. No antibiotic is contraindicated. What is contraindicated is plasma. Because normal plasma contains, strep pneumoniae contains neuraminidase which strips the RBC covering and exposes the Thomson-Fredrickson antigen. And normal plasma, because that antigen is normally masked, normal plasma contains antibodies against Thomson-Fredrickson. So you convert a microangiopathic hemolytic anemia to Coombs positive hemolytic.
And if at all it is needed, then it has to be washed.
Washed.
So one more question. In case many times in pediatric age group, if we are not able to label them as infectious etiology, in those cases, like, are we supposed to do genetic testing? Or
No,
like,
in an Indian pediatric setting, the one mandatory test is autoantibodies. If it's going to come, it's going to give you a 50 to 60% chance it's going to be correct, and then the treatment is easy. Even the International Pediatric Nephrology Association guidelines says antibody-mediated disease use plasma exchange, although they recommend eculizumab otherwise. But they said this, and this is based on the AIM study. So it's one situation where an Indian study has actually influenced the world guideline in this situation. And you are going to treat these patients not just with plasma exchange, but also with immunosuppression. We use prednisolone and azathioprine because it's cheap. We have not used rituximab in more than one patient up till now, and we haven't had bad results because of our not using rituximab. So we would treat these patients for a long period of time, a minimum of 1 year, and preferably what is recommended by both the IPNA as well as by the KDIGO consensus statement, that till the C3 levels are normal and the anti-factor H antibody titer has been negative for 6 months, you have to continue immunosuppression. So this is the one test I would definitely recommend. We don't do genetic tests in all pediatric patients because there's a 50 to 60% chance that they will be antibody. If the antibodies are negative, yes, go ahead.
How is the long-term prognosis of HUS in pediatric?
So, I treated my first pediatric patient, the girl whose photo you saw at the end, in 2003. She was my first pediatric patient I treated with plasma exchange. She's normal today, normal renal function. 16 years later, she's about to complete her B.Pharm next month.
Thank you, sir. Any questions from audience?
Sure. Yeah.
She's a fashion designer.
Yeah, drugs do cause. I've had OCP related HUS, and we've seen a fair amount with cyclosporin and tacrolimus. So again, I want to talk about HUS all day, so I restricted myself to a few aspects. But yes, drugs do cause.